Living in a simulation, am I creating the things that I'm facing? Are we living in a simulation? Is this a co-creation?
The introduction of zombies in popular culture has a dark and traumatic history that is rarely discussed. To truly discover the origins of the zombie myth, we must look back to an unexpected place in time: Haiti, during the height of the slave trade. The general consensus is that the myth began as a warning to Haitian slaves of what would happen to them if they refused to work or committed suicide to escape their torment. The slave owners, knowing how cruel they had been to the enslaved peoples, were scared that the natives of Haiti would revolt and use dark magic or voodoo against them as retribution for their torture. In an attempt to combat this, the slave owners created the myth that if the slaves accepted their new lives and worked hard, that when they died, they would reach an afterlife known as Langini, a stand-in for Guinea or more generally Africa. However, if they refused to work or committed suicide, they would not be allowed to reach Langini. Those who did not reach this promised land would be forced to work for their master for the rest of eternity, neither living nor dead. This combined elements of both Christianity and voodoo and was often used as a way to control the enslaved peoples and force them to submit to their torture. To get a better idea of where this myth came from and how it evolved over time, I interviewed Kevin Lyons. Kevin Lyons is a filmmaker and has worked on and written extensively about film throughout his career, and particularly about horror in his website.
I'm Kevin Lyons, and I edit the website, the Encyclopedia of Fantastic Film and Television, which is rather a pompous title for what is basically an encyclopedia of horror, science fiction, and fantasy film. And of course, the zombie film plays a huge part in that. It's been part of the various genres virtually since the start of cinema. It's one of the few monster movies that you can actually find a dividing line when it's split very neatly in two. And that dividing line comes in October 1968. There's a period of the zombie film before October 1968, and then there's George Romero. And Night of the Living Dead was released in October 68. That changed everything. What came after that was very, very different to what came before. What came before was largely based on the folklore of the zombie. They weren't masses of flesh-eating ghouls that were just coming back to destroy humanity. They tended to be small groups of reanimated people, mostly in slavery to a zombie master. And this all came from Haitian mythology. And this was from the whole voodoo cult thing, where this apparently happened quite a lot, that, you get plantation owners would send out their local lackeys who were well versed in voodoo to apparently raise an army of the dead, who would then work, of course, for free on the plantations.
I have been on a journey, seeking men for my mill. Men, they work faithfully. They are not worried about long hours. You could make good use of men like mine on your plantation.
It was a mythology that was important to the people who believed in it. And because they'd been living under these appalling colonial conditions of slavery, the idea that someone would then come along and, even when they were dead, still use their bodies for slavery was, we can't begin to imagine that. Try to put yourself in the place of a Haitian who believed very strongly in voodoo, had the sort of the Catholic elements of the religion in there as well, and was being told that we can come for you, even when you're dead, you're ours. You're never going to get away from us.
Driver, what is it?
It's a funeral, mademoiselle. They're afraid of the men who steal dead bodies. So they dig the grave in the middle of the road, where people pass all of the time.
What a method of social control that would be. This is where it all came from. It was all around the Caribbean, but Haiti is where we sort of associate it coming from, really. And, this notion of the undead cadaver that gets up and walks and works and so on, it was widespread in the region, even by the time that a guy called Lafcadio Hearn turned up there. He was in Martinique in the late 1880s, and he found the locals already muttering dire warnings about these poor cadaveres who were roaming about the countryside. And, you know, this sort of got translated into English, and this idea, this myth of the zombie really took off. For those very reasons, I think that, you know, the fact that even after death, they can come for us, they can still use us. And the zombie has always been a wonderful tool for metaphor. And you'll see that a lot more post George Romero. You'll see that it's been a metaphor for everything, from AIDS to SARS to consumerism to whatever you like. Back then, it was very much a metaphor for slavery, but also a metaphor for capitalism. The capitalism will get you even when you're dead. You can't escape the capitalist pigs that are coming after you. You know, the zombie master will raise you from your grave and make you work again. And that's a really potent image, I think, you know, for people who were, they were superstitious and they believed that these things were true and these things actually happened. I mean, what a marvelous way to keep a population down. I think this is why the older zombie films are the creepier ones in some ways, right up to Night of the Living Dead, which is right on that cusp, and it's just a crossover, it's a transitional film. Now they're sort of mouldering corpses. They do look like they're dead. There are bits dropping off them, and they're quite a horrible size. Back then, they didn't look like that. Like you say, they looked like us. And that's what made them so scary, that we could identify with a zombie, I think, more than we could identify with a werewolf or a vampire, because they're different. They do look different to us. A zombie doesn't, or didn't back then. It was just this poor shuffling corpse that had been reanimated.
Yeah, and even in vampires and werewolves, there's still that level of agency of you're trapped in this sort of situation. Vampires especially, you might be in this situation that you don't want to be in, but you still have that control over who you are and what you do.
You have power, and you know, the vampires are sexy, zombies are not, bless them. They've got nothing. There's you know, they are slaves. I think, you know, even sort of post-Romero zombies are kind of slaves in a different way. They're sort of slaves to a virus. They're slaves to a mutation, slaves to something else. They're still being forced to do something that they wouldn't do in life, and they have no control over it. But I think it's much more explicit in those early films like White Zombie, and you also had things like I Walked with a Zombie, which is much more explicit, I think, about its slavery roots, because the zombies in that, they are black,
yeah.
And they are, you know, it makes no bones about it that they brought black people back to life to enslave them. That's, you know, that's how it works.
I mean, yeah, the main guy in that film, he has a plantation, doesn't he? And he talks about how horrific the Western world was to slaves and to people of color, and yet he still he's still the cheap labor. I mean, it's not slaves. I thought it was a really interesting part about that, where he's talking about the statue of Saint Domingue, where he's explaining to the lead girl about how brutal and savage they were to the enslaved peoples. And yeah, he still has this sugar plantation.
Why was the maid crying?
I'm not sure I can make you understand. Do you know what this is?
Figure of Saint Sebastian.
Yes. But it was once the figurehead of a slave ship. That's where our people came from the misery and pain of slavery. For generations, they found life a burden. That's why they still weep when a child is born and make merry at a burial. I've told you, Miss Connell, this is a sad place.
But it is that thing, isn't it, that, you know, sort of for wealthy white Western people, words were cheap. It's very easy to say, oh yeah, it's all horrible, isn't it? It's all horrible, but don't look over there because I'm doing it again. You know, I'm on your side, honestly I am, but no, I'm not. I'm just as venal and revolting as they always were. And that's one of the nice things about that film, I think, that it does bring that out, that it does actually sort of put that front and center, that we can, and it's kind of a thing, I think we see it now, even on social media, you know, where people sort of like, oh yes, I'm very much against this. And then you think, are you really against this? Are you doing anything about this? Or are you just saying it? Because it's very easy when you're in a privileged position like we are to say, oh yes, down with that sort of thing. But then to just sort of turn a blind eye when that sort of thing actually helps you. And I think in I Walked with a Zombie, that's very much a case of that. He doesn't like the idea of slavery, and he doesn't like the idea of exploiting the local people. But hey, it makes him loads of money, so why not? He can live with it.
Oh, definitely. I'm very reminiscent of corporations now putting up Black Lives Matter signs and Pride, putting out Pride products and things. Yeah. I think that's something that's really interesting about the zombies themselves, not just in films that are explicitly about consumerism, because there are zombie films about that explicitly, but even in the ones that aren't, there is always this subtle critique of capitalism, especially in those original.
Oh, definitely. And even in things like Hammer's Plague of the Zombies from the mid-60s, the race element is removed because they transplant the story to Cornwall. But it's a tin mine, so it's still, it becomes a terribly English tale of class warfare. You've got this sort of this toff who's been out to the Caribbean, learnt voodoo, and now he's raising the bodies of the poor and the working class to carry on working in his tin mine for him.
No corpse can remain at peace in this village of the undead, this land of the zombies. In this place, no one is safe. No one can hide from witchcraft, superstition, and fear.
Young Martinez also says that he saw something on the moors, something that he insists was his brother. But we know that his brother is dead. We also know that he is not lying in his coffin. Someone in this village is practicing witchcraft. That corpse wandering on the moors is an undead, a zombie.
All those early films were all about capitalism in one way or another. It was all about, it could harken back to the whole sort of slavery thing, but slavery in itself was capitalism. And, whenever you see things like in White Zombie and you see I Walked with a Zombie, Plague of the Zombies, they're all about people trying to exploit other people that they regard as being lesser than them, so that they can line their pockets and make money. So yeah, I mean, that's exactly what zombie films have always been about. Even before, with Romero, it's very explicit that it's about consumerism and capitalism and all the rest of it. But I think it's there in the early films as well. They weren't, because of the cultures in which they were made, they weren't allowed to make grand political gestures in these films. By 1968, all those bets were off and Romero could do that. And he did it, and particularly in the first film, I think he did absolutely brilliantly. So it's always been there. His greatest of all the metaphors for the zombie is capitalism. You can use it for anything else, but that's the one that really, really matters, I think.
I do think that's very interesting, the concept of zombies as a metaphor. I think that's something that has just been a consistent thread throughout all of these films. Zombies are in some way this perfect blank slate to project onto, and just that fear of the other, or concerns about things like capitalism, war, and so many different things. It doesn't seem to be that way with any other sort of monsters.
It is, as you said, it's because they are a blank slate. A zombie can be whatever you want it to be. It's an animated corpse that looks like a human being, and it therefore can be anything we want to attach to it. A vampire, there's things you can do with vampires regarding sex and sexuality and power and all the rest of it. But we hear terms like, he was being very vampiric in his relationships and all the rest of it. But he's never caught on quite the same way as, look at all those zombies shuffling off to work every day, that kind of thing. That's become part of the language now, because we see this as this fantastic word that we can attach to anything that we want to comment on at any given time. And that happens even now with the cheapest knockoff zombie films. And trust me, go and hang around on Amazon Prime for 10 minutes and just type in zombie, and you'll find some of the cheapest knockoffs you'll ever see in your life. Even by accident, I think they managed to get a kind of metaphor in there anyway, because there's nothing to them. You have to attach something to them, and you make of that what you will.
Yeah, and I think when you watch these films, I don't necessarily think it's always the filmmaker putting these ideas. It's what we read into them. I was discussing this with one of my other contributors. He is more focused on Italian giallo films. And he said that a lot of these films there was no sort of, it was just whatever makes money. It wasn't what's your film about, it's what film is your film like. And people read so much into these films about what the cultural context and what does it mean. And really, it was just about making money. Like, there might have been like some ideas of and there might, you know, the filmmakers still might have been putting those ideas in, but generally, a lot of times, it's what will make them quick money, because they were just making so many films at the same time that it wasn't really about thought process.
Even Night of the Living Dead was made because Ramiro and his colleagues, they were making commercials. They were making, you know, some commercial films, and they wanted something a little bit more ambitious to do. And they thought, let's make a feature film. And they looked around and thought, what can we do that's cheap? I know, let's make a horror film. We'll do it in black and white. Because they knew that black and white was cheap and people love horror films. They've always loved horror films. I think you're right. I think, you know, in that first one, he wasn't trying to make a point. There is a point. There's a lot of points in Night of the Living Dead about Vietnam, about race, which is entirely accidental, because when they cast the lead role, they didn't cast a black guy, write it as a black guy. It's just he was the best guy that turned up to do the part.
Dwayne Jones, the actor who played Ben, was very concerned about his being African American. We were going, hey, come on, man, it's 1968. We're all past all of it. Little did we know, when we made the first print of the movie and we were driving it to New York, we heard, driving in the car, heard the news on the radio that Martin Luther King had been assassinated. Now all of a sudden it was a black film. It became a black film. Even though when Jack Russo and I wrote the script, the character in the script, we assumed him to be white. When Dwayne agreed to play the role, we didn't change the script. The same things would have happened to him if the actor had been white. The fact that these redneck posse guys shot him, that became racial instead of just a mistaken identity, which is really what we intended. Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons that people believe to this day that it's important.
But I think with Night of the Living Dead, he wasn't trying to make a point. He was trying to make a really good horror film. One of the reasons I feel slightly more ambivalent about Dawn of the Dead, I think he was trying to make a point. And, you know, so within half an hour, we've got the point. Yes, it's about consumerism. We get it, George. Nice, that's great. Can we get on with it now? And it's another hour and a half of being beaten over the head with zombies equal consumerism.
Imagine, if you will, that something has gone terribly wrong. Shoot it, man. Now, accept the fact that there's no escaping the horrible consequences. Night of the Living Dead has ended. Dawn of the Dead is here.
What the hell is it? Looks like a shopping center, one of those big indoor malls.
What are they doing? Why do they come here?
Some kind of instinct, memory, what they used to do. This was an important place in their lives.
We have spawned our own savagery. Soon it will consume us all. It is a horrible, hauntingly accurate vision of the mindless excesses of a society gone mad.
I'm old, but I'm not old enough to have been an adult during the Vietnam War. But the people who were, those young people who were, you know, sort of 15, 16, 17 in 1968, would have been coming to Night of the Living Dead and thinking, that's what it's like in Vietnam, isn't it? You know, it is these sort of two forces fighting each other, and we see the opposition as faceless, mindless, massive people who are coming to destroy our way of life. You know, whether or not Ramiro meant that is kind of irrelevant. I'm sure he did, but it's kind of irrelevant. It's what we brought to the film when we looked at it. And that's I think the hallmark of a really good horror movie, when you can look at it, and you can have a lot of fun with, you know, I love those Lucio Fulci Italian zombie films. I adore them. Zombie Flesh Eater is one of my favorite films of all time. But honestly, it hasn't got a thought in its brainless head. It's, you know, it's there to be gory and nasty and hot, and it succeeds brilliantly on that level. I don't think for 1 minute Lucio Fulci was thinking, I wonder what metaphor I can put into zombie flesh eaters. He was just thinking, well, that film was successful, let's make another one. And there's nothing wrong with that. Don't get me wrong, I'm not criticizing that. Look what we ended up with. We ended up with some of the greatest zombie movies ever. But I think, sometimes you can watch a horror film and you can look at it and you think, I wonder if that's what it's about. I wonder if that's what it means. And I want to be able to work it out for myself, which is why Dawn is the lesser of the first three for me, because I'm being told at the time this is what it's about. With Night, when I first saw it, I didn't really know a great deal about it. I'm certainly old enough for it to be pre-internet when I first saw Night of the Living Dead, so there wasn't as much written about it. But even then, I was thinking, this feels like it means something. This feels like it could only have been made in 1968. And that's not something you feel from the earlier films, because, like I say, in the context of when they were made, they weren't being encouraged to make political or social points. But by 1968, revolution was in the air. People were complaining and moaning about everything, and quite rightly so. And they were putting it into their music, into their books, and now into their horror films.
So when it comes to more recent films, do you think that these filmmakers are trying to make a point, trying to argue something about our perception of the other in society?
Yeah, I think people do still make points in zombie films. I think the problem nowadays is there are so many of them, that it's hard to find the ones that are making the points. And sometimes I wonder if we don't always get the point because it's from a different culture. The majority of the films we've talked about so far have been either American or European, but you can start looking further afield. There's a wonderful film called Pontypool. It's a Canadian film about conversationalists who we barely see. It's all set inside this radio studio in a basement, and there's an outbreak happening outside.
This is Radio 660, The Beacon. Ken? Are you there, Ken?
This building has just been exploded. Oh my God! Hundreds of people are getting killed down there.
Soldiers have set up roadblocks.
Everybody has to stay inside at all times.
Ken?
He's looking at me.
Canada could only have been the only country that could have made this film, because the transmission agency in it is language. It's the English language. It's somehow the whatever casting its spell over the people is coming through words. And of course, Canada in some places is bilingual, and there's a lot of politics involved in that, which if we're not Canadian, we don't always really see the nuances of. I think Canadian viewers would see the fact that they have to start talking French to each other to prevent the spread of the infection. I think that would be much more politically charged than it would for me sitting here in central London, not having a clue what that really means to people. Similarly, I think, we've seen films from Japan and Korea recently, Train to Busan being a fantastic Korean example. There are bits in that where you kind of think, I don't really understand what this means. It feels like it means something, but I don't think I'm culturally aware enough to be able to dig into it and actually understand what it means. So that's a challenge to us as a viewer, and I think that's a good thing. I think, I should go out there and try and find out what are the nuances of Train to Busan. Train to Busan works brilliantly as a fantastic zombie film about, zombies on a train. Brilliant. What more could you want? But I wonder if there's more to that, if there's more to be teased out from it. And I think they do put these things. I think, you look at some zombie films and you wonder if they've had a single thought in their entire heads during the whole production. They're just awful. But there are still ones being made where I do think, yeah, you know what, you are actually sort of putting some thought into this, aren't you? This does mean something to you, if not to anybody else.
Zombies have been used as metaphors for a wide variety of issues throughout time, from slavery and race relations to consumerism to specific conflicts around the world such as the Vietnam War. It would seem that zombies are the ultimate blank canvas to project whatever cultural fear or phenomenon is currently relevant. This is not surprising, as that was the very reason they were invented in the first place. However, what is surprising is how long the trope has endured and just how versatile they can be. Filmmakers, writers and artists began using zombies as a metaphor to tell a larger and more complex story. This could explain why this subgenre has persisted for so long and evolved so dramatically since its origin back in French-occupied Haiti. Considering the trajectory of other monster movie creatures such as Frankenstein's monster, mummies and Dracula, zombies have enjoyed a remarkably long tenure in the cultural zeitgeist, and it does not seem as if they will be disappearing anytime soon. This seems to be a direct result of their versatility as a concept. It seems clear that zombie media is a very unique case study in how media and cultural attitudes can shift over time.
Am I living in a simulation? Am I creating the things that I'm facing? Are we living in a simulation? Is this a co-creation? If I'm living in a simulation, shouldn't I be levitating, narrating an amazing exploration? This planet feels like a slave ship. We can't escape it, the watch is our whip. We're told to embrace it as we sip the Kool-Aid they give.